Okay, hello everyone and welcome back to session 2, management of fall armyworm with sprayable BT. And this is a follow-up of a very successful and very popular first session that we had earlier in the year. And this time we're really going to try and go into the field and bring you right to what's happening on the ground and actually show you fall armyworm and actually show you how to use BT in the field and give you some real good tips and best practice for using BT. So we're really excited to have everyone here. I know that a lot of people will be joining us as we go through the session. So thank you for joining early, but also thank you for your interest, and also I get a lot of feedback. So it's very nice to have seen that as well between sessions. We have a lot of people in the room already from all across the region, but also further afield. So that is great to see. So if you do, please take the time, to introduce yourself in the chat. It's a really nice way of getting to know who's around and who's interested in this topic. Right, I'm going to sort of, just before I move on, actually, I'm just going to say a big thanks to Cabby first, who we're doing this big series in conjunction with and partnership with, but also a huge thanks to Valiant Biosciences and Sumitomo Chemical, who are not only helping with these first 2 sessions, they have been a huge support in implementing and developing and running 2 masterclass series that we've been running and have run over the last 2 months on regulation and biocontrol, but also research and biocontrol. So it's been fantastic to be working with Daniel and the team. So without further ado, I'd just like to move on and just remind everyone, and everyone knows this, but if you could write all your questions that you have in the Q&A, that would be fantastic. It just allows us to manage all those questions in quite a sort of efficient manner. I can just look in there, and then I try and actually ask all the questions. So don't worry, I do try and get through all of them. We also have not only Daniel, who will be giving the presentation, we also have Chris Moses online from within the region, a huge amount of experience, obviously, in application of BT, and he'll be able to answer any of your questions as well. And last time was very busy in the Q&A. So don't feel shy, please ask lots of questions, because here's your opportunity. And this is a really great opportunity, actually, and we'll be following this up with other sessions throughout the year and other topics. So if you move to the next slide, you'll see that this is number 2 today, but we've got 3 which we'll be looking at new frontiers. So we're really going to be looking at what are some of those new things out there that may not be commonly applied yet, or even maybe really on the sort of boundaries of sort of novel sort of type of approaches. We just thought we would give some sort of blue sky thinking, but also look at some things that have been common, starting to be used elsewhere, but haven't quite been scaled up or implemented in Southeast Asia. And then you'll see a lot of other good topics there that we'll be exploring in detail. So really exciting series across the year. And you can register for all those sessions at the events page at aseanfawaction.org. Now, the next page, I'm just going to remind people that if you do have a question and it's not answered in this workshop, but you have another burning question, or you want to share some of your work and you haven't got the opportunity to share it in the chat today, please do join the forum, and you can just write a comment in the forum or a question, and we try to answer them, or we try to create a bit of a discussion there. And I will be giving certificates for participation. So just keep sending me a bit of a reminder if I haven't done that, but happy to do that for people who are watching today. So on the next page, I'm also going to just move into a bit of a poll just to get to know a little bit about you. So I'm going to launch that now. And there are 3 questions here. Have you ever applied a BT? Have you mixed a BT? And have you treated for fall armyworm? And I think we asked a couple of these questions last time, but we were just wondering if there may be new people in the room, and also just to get a bit of an idea before we launch into the session. So I'm just going to give people a little bit of time. Just remember, if you haven't introduced yourself, please do. I see we've got people from Vietnam, Cambodia, Philippines, Burkina Faso, more from Vietnam, Indonesia, India, Australia, Papua New Guinea, France, Malaysia, Myanmar. Quite a few there actually, and there's quite a few double ups there as well. So I'm going to end the poll very soon. I'm going to do that now, and we're just going to have a bit of an idea of who's in the room, who's been working on what. So you should be able to see that. Can you see that, Daniel? Yep. Have you ever applied a BT?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So we've got some people now. You've got some good questions coming up, Daniel. Have you ever applied a BT? Yes, 56%. No, 44%. So that is a really interesting mix. Have you mixed a BT? Yeah. Yes and no. And that's quite interesting as well, because those who have used it may not have mixed it. I can see there. And have you treated for fall armyworm? Actually 39% yes. So this is actually really good. It's going to be a really interesting audience, and it's going to be, I think, really useful because we've got some experience in the room as well. So we'll really be interested in hearing your thoughts on your experiences with BT and also fall armyworm. So that is great to know. So without sort of prolonging my piece any longer, I'd really like to get into today's session and really talk about this management of fall armyworm with sprayable BT. And I'm very, very happy to be welcoming Daniel back to be talking about this part too. There's a lot of interest in this that I've got so far. So I think a lot of people will be watching the video too, Daniel. So no pressure, but I know you'll do great. And Daniel is really the technical development specialist on this topic at Valiant Biosciences. So it's actually a pleasure to have you, and we're very lucky. So please start, Daniel.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So as Allison mentioned, today will be the second part of our two-part series on BTs. And before I begin, I actually also want to promote the master classes that are available in full on the ACN Fall Armyworm management website. They're really interesting look into how to register and how to regulate BTs, but also how to develop biopesticides, but also how to regulate, how to develop and launch your own biopesticides. A really, really cool look into that. And so before I begin, I would like to take a step back and review a few points from the last presentation that I gave, because it has a lot of relevance to how to apply a BT out in the environment. So first of all, what is a BT? On the left-hand side, you'll see this. This is a large picture of a single BT cell, and you can see it contains a viable spore, which is kind of like the seed of a BT, and the insecticidal crystal proteins or cry proteins. Now, those cry proteins naturally crystallize in the cell, and that's the primary mode of action, which forms pores in the midgut. Those viable spores will germinate in the insect gut, so not in the plant or in the bag or the bottle. And it helps, but doesn't kill the insect in and of itself. There's also other soluble synergists and byproducts, for example, VIP3A, which has the same mode of action as cry proteins, but has a unique target site, or other secondary compounds that synergize cry proteins like PD100 and enzymes. Now, first, I'd like to focus on the cry proteins, because really that's the tip of the spear when it comes to the mode of action of a commercial BT. And so therefore, when we talk about mixing, things that influence that crystal or those proteins are going to be very important to keep in mind. You'll also notice that these things are relatively large. So just maybe on a microscopic scale, but the crystal and the spores are anywhere from 1 to 2 microns wide. The human hair, I think, is on average about 100 microns wide. So just to give you an idea of scale, these things can't they're too big to move into the plant. And so another important aspect is the fact that the cryproteins and viable spores will only cover the leaf surface and have no systemic activity. They won't move into the plant because unlike a chemical insecticide where the active ingredient is soluble, we have here these two very important insoluble components. And that really drives a lot of the decisions about how to use a BT. So as a reminder, the mode of action begins with ingesting the crystals and spores. BTs will only affect the larval stage of the fall armyworm. And so the insects will consume those crystals and spores. And then this is an important idea, and that's that the crystals will dissolve in the high pH of the caterpillar midgut. So as we'll talk about later, keeping the tank pH neutral is important. So once those crystals dissolve, the cryproteins are activated by the insect's own digestive system, which then, through a number of binding steps, will create pores in midgut cells. Those cells will then rupture, leading to all the other gut bacteria and BT spores moving into the hemocell, where they'll eventually kill the insect through sepsis. So here, that mode of action is very quick to stop feeding, but relatively slow to kill. And so finally, why use a BT in an integrated pest management program? Well, first of all, commercial BTs have been used for lepidopteran pest control for more than 50 years, including decades of use for fall armyworm management in the Americas. Applying a commercial BT as a first application when infestations begin can control fall armyworm while maintaining beneficial insect populations, as commercial BTs are highly selective for lepidopteran larvae and do not affect other insects or pollinators. The unique mode of action of commercial BTs can be used to prevent insecticide resistance from developing by controlling larvae resistant to other insecticidal classes. There's actually no known cross resistance between the BT mode of action and any other insecticide class. And finally, commercial BTs have a relatively low risk compared to other insecticides, therefore minimizing the risks to applicators and to the environment. So these are just a number of reasons why you might consider using a commercial BT. And finally, there are a number of videos that are included in this session, and it was actually from a series of videos we took recently in Thailand. The idea was that we could pull together a series on how to apply BTs. So very much a summary of what we'll cover today, but in a relatively short, a few-minute video. So following this presentation, you'll have to keep a lookout for the summary video when it's produced. So before I get into too much detail, I did want to remind you to always read and follow the pesticide, label directions. The recommendations given in this presentation are not meant to replace any instructions, description of use pattern, or PPE requirements on product labels. Always follow the label instructions for personal protective equipment and application rates and timing. And of course, storage and disposal regulations will vary by location. Now, on top of the legal reasons to read a pesticide label, I think it's important to mention that there's also other added benefits to reading the pesticide label. Ensuring expected efficacy, as these labels are written for the specific products to ensure that application rates are consistent with expected levels of control. It'll also save you money by making sure you're using the correct rates and you get the level of control that you're expecting. And finally, it'll help you to protect yourself and the environment to ensure that you're protecting yourself properly. So again, any recommendations made during this presentation, it is a bit challenging to make recommendations that cover all BT products and not specific formulations, as there are some significant differences between formulations. So the most important considerations to be successful with a BT in the field is timing and coverage. Now, these two factors are important for other agrochemicals, but for BTs especially. And that's because the commercial BTs must be eaten. Commercial BTs have a relatively short life on the leaf, with anywhere from 3 to 5 days of peak activity before they'll degrade in the environment. So timing that application to the most susceptible larval stages is critically important. Also, coverage. As I mentioned before, commercial BTs are insoluble. So ensuring that all of the foliage is covered with those crystals and spores is critically important to success. And so encompassed within this, these two concepts is understanding when to apply and considerations for how to effectively apply the products to ensure that you'll get the most out of every BT application. And so to begin with, we'll start with a discussion on timing. So scouting and the decision to apply really starts with going out into the field and assessing what's out there. And so I put here a link to the ASEAN Fall Armyworm Action Plan publication site, where there are a number of articles and books about that have details about scouting and how to make the decision to apply. For example, there's a really nice FAO and CABI Fall Armyworm Field Handbook, where the explanation, some explanation of scouting starts on page 19. The Comprehensive Guide on Fall Armyworm Management using IPM has a whole chapter on going out into the field. And there's also on the right-hand side, you have here a CABI and USAID leaflet on where to look for damage, just sort of an easy primer on where to look when you're out in the field for the different larval instars. There's also a really nice publication on from the African experience that goes into really a great deal of detail into a lot of the aspects that I'll be talking about today. And so, so using these tools is really a good place to start. We're not going to go into detail necessarily on specifically how to scout the processes that you might take in your own particular fields, or that you might talk about with the local applicators. But the tools that you need are really provided by the Fall Armyworm Action Plan, which is really nice. And why scouting is so important is that timing application towards early instars ensures that you're targeting the most susceptible larval stages. So in this table here on the left-hand side, you'll see these are 1st through 5th instars from top to bottom. Across the top, we have 4 different species of caterpillar pests that are found in Brazil. These are the results of a diet-incorporated feeding assay conducted in Mato Grosso state. This one was back in 2016, just used as an example. And here a commercial BT is applied at 400 to 600 grams per hectare. This is a dry flowable formulation. And the relative efficacy of ability to control those pests is here represented in colors. So green is anywhere from 95 to 100% mortality, and red means less than 70% efficacy. And if we start on the left-hand side, the Chrysodexis includens is the soybean looper. This particular species is highly susceptible to BTs. And even up until the 5th instar with the higher rate, it can be effectively controlled using a BT application. But if you look to the right-hand side, the fall armyworm is only effectively controlled up until the 3rd instar. The same goes for Heliothis and even for Helicoverpa. So commercial BTs in general are most effective against 1st and 2nd instar larvae. This also goes for most agrochemicals, but for commercial BTs, it's especially the case. There are some exceptions, but with respect to fall armyworm, targeting early instars is really critically important to ensuring that that you can get the most out of a BT application. Excuse me. Now, when making the decision to apply a BT, you'll be looking really at the economic threshold. So the pest presence alone is not always a trigger for treatments. Economic threshold, achieving the economic threshold or exceeding the economic threshold triggers an application to prevent yield losses at an economic injury level. So when using a BT, it's often best practice to use the strictest economic thresholds so that you can effectively target the earliest instars where the BT can be most effective. And so there are going to be a number of these action thresholds will may vary by region, may vary by crop developmental stages. For example, earlier developmental stages, when the crop is very small, will have much lower economic thresholds, while later stages can tolerate much more damage before they the pest needs to be controlled. And I think that what's important to keep in mind about these thresholds is that the goal of these the goal of the models that were developed on when to treat for fall armyworm are really meant to save you money and to save your efforts. To make an application of any product earlier than is necessary simply means that you may have to make those applications again later on. And so when considering these models, it's important to keep in mind that they were specifically developed to give you the best level of control, but also ensure that you're not applying when you don't necessarily need to ensure that you get the most out of your crop. So one thing to look for when deciding on an application is the number of larvae you might find in the field and the crop damage. But when it comes to a commercial BT, the best time to apply is as close to egg hatch as possible. The eggs you might find in the field when you're looking will generally be found on the underside of leaves. Egg hatch actually occurs within about 3 to 5 days of laying. So timing that application within a week or so after you find eggs can ensure that the first instar larvae are targeted. And depending on the impact of weather conditions on larval development and whatnot, a BT should be applied before that third instar stage. And so what this means is that really the goal of these predictive models is to time the application to get as close to egg hatch as possible, but to also account for the fact that that egg hatch doesn't always occur as one on the same day or in the same time frame. And so allowing a certain level of damage and allowing a certain number of larvae to become present ensures that you have the best window for application where you'll be able to target the most larvae possible. A BT application applied right after eggs are laid may not necessarily still be effective once those eggs hatch. So ensuring that that you're outside the window of egg hatch, but still before those larvae exceed the developmental stages in which they can be most efficiently controlled, is really the goal of these application models. And so the number of larvae identified per plant, or the percent of infested plants, is most often used to time applications. So scouting pockets of plants across the field in a prescribed pattern will reveal either the number of larvae per plant or the number of plants that are infested with larvae, and give you an idea about the overall infestation level. So for example, you may see economic thresholds of, say, for example, 20% of infested plants. So for a corn crop in early developmental stages, that threshold may be 20%, while in later stages may increase to 40%. You may also find thresholds that reference the number of larvae. So for example, if on average, 2 larvae per plant are identified, that could trigger an application. Or finally, I've heard some recommendations around the level of infestation, that even if the level of infestation is relatively low, if it's very consistent across a number of rows, then it could be indicative of a severe infestation and could trigger an application in those cases too. So these are just a number of tools that can be used to time the application. And the goal really is to ensure that we're targeting the most susceptible life stages. So there are other indicators of the developmental stages that can also help to determine when a BT should be used and when it might not necessarily be the right tool. So for example, early in the infestation, when larvae are still in the early instars, you may see this kind of windowing effect. You can see those white spots on the leaves. This is indicative of the damage caused by early instars that can only really scrape off the top layer of the leaf surface. Now, the presence of frass usually suggests that third instar larvae or later are present on the plant. And on the right-hand side, that severe level of damage is really indicative of fourth and fifth instar larvae. And why I wanted to point this out is that the optimal time to apply a BT will be when you see this level of windowing, indicative of damage from early instar larvae. Once you start to see the telltale signs of later instars, like the presence of frass, or on the right-hand side, that severe level of damage, then it may become necessary to either include another control option, so including another insecticide into the mix, or in the case of the severe damage you'll see on the right-hand side, if the populations are predominantly in the later instar stage, it may be best practice not to use a commercial BT at all. As you saw in that earlier table, those later instars are relatively they're relatively not susceptible to commercial BTs, and so maybe more acutely toxic agrochemicals will be necessary in those particular cases. So you can gather from just a visual assessment as well about when an application could be made. And there is in fact a model used to determine that application timing, what's often referred to as the Davis scale. So this scale is This skill is establishes the infestation level based on either foliar damage or damage to the ears of corn. And so you can see from left to right, as the level of severity of damage increases, so does the Davis scale metric. And so by using the same kind of scouting tactics that you might use for identifying the number of larvae and so forth, you could also look at the average Davis scale. And for example, you may use a trigger of maybe 3 on the Davis scale to determine when an application should be made. And this tool is really nice because it does give a broader visual assessment of the crop to determine when a commercial BT could be used, and especially for it to be most effective. And finally, some examples about using those using scouting to time the decision to make an application. So if the scouting reveals that that the larval infestation, the level of damage, is below the economic threshold, then in these cases it's best just not to treat. To continue scouting regularly, however, and to watch for other indicators of infestations. So even if you see the pest in the field, you can save money and wait. And I think it's an important consideration to make, because just because the pest is present doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be controlled. There are levels of infestation that will cause the severe damage, and those are the levels that need to be treated for. So if the level of infestation is found to be above the economic threshold, then it's time to treat with a pesticide. If the population is predominantly early instars, then you could consider a standalone BT application to effectively control that initial population, while also ensuring that you're not going to knock down beneficial insect populations that can then naturally control further infestation. Now, if the population is mixed, you may need to consider using a tank mix partner to control the later instars. In some cases, commercial BTs have been known to have an additive effect with other insecticides, and in some cases, even a synergistic effect. because they target completely different sites from every other insecticide on the market. Now, if the population is predominantly later instars, a BT may not necessarily be the appropriate tool to use at that time. In those cases, you'll probably want to use something something more acutely toxic to the later instars. And just as an example of this, I have on the right-hand side here, this is a video that was taken out in our the field that we used in Thailand to collect the footage. And here you can see the later instars are is already deep within the whorl. This larvae is not likely to be effectively controlled using a commercial BT. However, this much smaller larvae that's crawling out in the middle here could be effectively controlled using a commercial BT. And so for that reason, in this situation, it might be best to include another control measure in the application regime. And so I'll pause here for a minute and take any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. And the footage is fantastic. I love that last frame that you just had there, showing the 2 instars is quite. When I say fantastic, not good to see, of course, because but it is really nice to actually see both of them. And I guess that was one of the questions, and you sort of just answered that around what do you do when you've got different, I guess, stages, and how do you take that into account? Any more tips on that and how you would manage that using BT? I mean, you gave a bit of an idea there around and a mixed tank mix. What do you mean by that? What could be a tip or a little bit more clarity on that?
Sure. So Chris is on the line. Maybe he could suggest what are the most common tank mixes, but this would be including other agrochemicals like. We've seen that commercial BTs and diamide chemistries tend to work really well together. And so maybe when you have mixed larval stages like we saw there, including those 2 products in combination. So the regular dose of both products, not necessarily cutting rates on either, but using the labeled rates of each insecticide, can not only control the insects themselves, they can also have an additive effect. So not only would we effectively control the young larval stages, but there'll be sort of an additive effect on the later stages as well. We've seen this in other insects too.
Yeah, excellent. And another question here was how to manage different thresholds when you have 2 or more species at the same time.
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. I admit I don't have a good answer to that. Chris, are you on the line?
Yes, Daniel. Yeah, I tried to answer this question in the question and answer session, but still I'll add something more here. Maybe, in different species of Spoda, the Helicoverpa, Heliothes or Helicoverpa, the efficacy is good when it is applied when the larvae are in the young stage, the first or second or third instar that we have seen in one of the slides shown by you. So that is going to be critical now. So that is not a problem. Only thing is we have to see what is the ETL level, how many larvae are needed in that stage, which warrants the chemical treatment. So that depends upon the species, and that depends on the crop as well. So as long as that is taken care of, probably there should not be any problem. That's what it is.
Okay, thanks, Chris.
Right. So whichever species exceeds that economic threshold will trigger the application.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Great, thank you. Here's another question here just around the Mato Grosso state publication in that location that you referred to. I think you had an example. Is there a publication about that work? Somebody's asking.
There might be. I'm not so familiar. I have this from a study that we had done with them specifically. You can find. I mean, the literature is really ripe with efficacy trials across the board. I think last time I showed an interesting study from Mexico, where they were looking at variable susceptibility across different fields. So there's really a great deal of interesting literature on larval susceptibility. I'm not so sure if there's a specific publication around that data specifically.
Okay. Excellent, but thanks, Daniel. And we've got quite a few questions in here. I'm going to leave some of these to Chris because some of them are around economic thresholds, but also what to mix with BT when you've got mixed larval instars. And there's a few technical ones that I think Chris will be able to answer, and I'm sure he'll be busy. There's a question here about is there a difference in the BT, I guess, reaction to BT or the response to BT between different strains of fall armyworm? So between the corn or maize strain and the rice strain, does that make a difference?
So the question is are these different strains have different susceptibilities to the BT?
Exactly. Yep.
It's distinctly possible. So the example I just gave about the fields in Mexico showed that there was actually some regional differences in susceptibility. Commercial BTs, the cry proteins in commercial BTs bind to specific receptors in the caterpillar's stomach, and I mean, just differences between even populations can mean different concentrations of those receptors. This is how resistance develops, is that eventually over time, there's a selection for insects that just don't have those receptors anymore or have them changed. So seeing different levels of susceptibility between even different variants within the same species is not uncommon. We wouldn't necessarily expect to see like a dramatic loss of efficacy going from one type of armyworm to another. I think we would overall expect to see the same level of efficacy, but it would not be unexpected to see differences. And that's a big reason for adhering to recommended label rates and things like that, because these rates are determined based off a myriad of efficacy trials that one would hope would cover the kind of variability that you might expect to see out in the field.
Yeah.
Yeah, so ensuring, using appropriate application rates would hopefully kind of level the playing field, even with differences between the types of armyworms.
Okay, great, Daniel. Does a pyrethroid have a negative impact on BT?
No, not necessarily. Commercial BTs do work through ingestion, so the larvae they do have to eat the BT. Younger larvae that might be knocked down by the pyrethroids didn't necessarily need the BT anyway. So they actually work very well together, and it's probably the most common take mix partner with commercial BTs are different types of pyrethroids.
Yeah. And actually there was a question before, Daniel, there's actually quite a few questions, but another one is, I really liked that the picture you had there of the leaves across the Davis scale. I thought that was just great because you just don't often see that so nicely illustrated. So thank you for that. Somebody was asking about the use of pheromone traps, like whether that's a good way, I guess, to ascertain when to use a BT biopesticide. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think pheromone traps are really the way to go. If they're accessible and there are really well-developed models in a particular area, then using pheromone traps can help you time an application, regardless of going out into the field and scouting on your own. They can be such valuable tools to understand what's coming into the field, as opposed to looking for what's already there. Yeah. So pheromone traps will collect the adult stages, the moths. And so by counting the moths, we can map out those populations and then determine the thresholds based off the presumed egg laying that's going on in the field. And so that way, based on peak moth flights, you can time your applications so that you get that earliest instar, that you time it as close as possible, and that you don't necessarily have to hope that you don't have a lot of hot spots. Because when scouting out in the field, you'll hope that you'll get a good representation of what's out there. But having a tool that collects a much larger area will give you a much better idea about what's out there. So I think whenever possible, using pheromone traps as one of your tools is probably the best way to go.
Excellent. Great. Thank you so much. I think we'll leave it there for now and carry on, because I know there'll be more questions coming. I can already see more questions coming in. But let's move on and find out a little bit more about what you've got to tell us.
Okay, so at this point, it's presumed that we've decided that we're going to make an application of a commercial BT. And so now we'll start to select a product. And the next step really is to determine what personal protective equipment will be necessary. And it's important to note that this PPE will vary between countries and between products. So I have here as an example, on the left-hand side is the Zentari product in Thailand. And so here for mixing, a face covering and gloves are required for mixing, and a mask and gloves are required for application. Now, another BT in Indonesia, in this case, the Dipel SC formulation, requires similar tools for mixing, but requires full protective equipment, a full body covering for actually making the application. This can vary between products. This can vary between different formulations within the same country. So it's important to look at the, you can use these really easy tools to look at what PPE is going to be required. Now, I think it's important to note that personal protective equipment is determined based on two things. One is just a baseline level of protection that local authorities think is important, but it's also based on actual toxicology. So applying these products to, more often than not, animal models to look for a reaction. So if a pesticide label has specific requirements to protect yourself, it's usually for a really good reason. And there is, in most cases, some potential harm that can happen. So reading the label, looking at protective equipment is really the important place to start to ensure that you yourself are protected when making applications. Now, mixing a BT is really a lot like all other agrochemicals. There are only a few specific considerations to make that I'd like to focus on here. So as you can see, the example I have here is a wettable granule formulation. That label probably looks familiar. This video was collected in Thailand. And so with commercial BTs, one important consideration to make is that those crystals and spores, as we mentioned at the beginning, are insoluble by nature. And so for that reason, pre-mixing and really thorough mixing before loading it into the tank can be valuable to ensure that, especially with these granule formulations, the material is well dispersed prior to going into the tank. Now, commercial BTs, whether they're a dry formulation like you see here, or even the liquid formulations, may settle with time. So commercial BTs are insoluble by nature, and therefore settling may occur with time. Even though BT do not necessarily dissolve completely, they are formulated not to block nozzles. So seeing this amount of material on the bottom after mixing isn't necessarily a problem. It's more often expected. And any commercial BT you're using, that dissolves completely is unlikely to be a BT, as commercial BTs should not be completely soluble. You should expect to see settling with time. And that's just a matter of the fact that we're using a bacteria. Unlike chemical insecticides that will fully dissolve and will stay within, become a solution where you'll have the chemical insecticide throughout the whole the whole volume of water. With commercial BTs, it's important to continually agitate if possible, to ensure that you're continually mixing those crystals and spores and keeping them in suspension. So those are the two distinctions between a commercial BT and a chemical insecticide. Is with a chemical insecticide, we have a solution, and with BTs, we have a suspension. Which means that we have to treat it as such when we're making that application. Now, normally, after mixing and then going out into the field with, say, a backpack sprayer, the level of settling, you wouldn't expect to see a level of settling in a backpack before the entire volume is sprayed. But again, even if you do see in your pre-mixing, in the slurry mixing, if you do see some of that that settling, it's not necessarily mean it's going to cause issues with the application. Now, it's important here also to mention to always follow label recommendations for application rate. And that's because application rates are based on efficacy trials to achieve a specific level of performance. And of course, this will vary from product to product. Lower BT rates means less cryoprotein on the plant surface, leading to greater performance variability. That's really the thing that we're considering here. The insects will, in those cases, consume fewer BT crystals in a given feeding area, which means that they can cause more damage before being controlled, or can survive long enough to get into later larval stages where they're less susceptible. So this graph on the right shows relative efficacy versus on the bottom here, percent BT toxin crystal density relative to a labeled rate. So for example, 100% would mean a full labeled rate of the commercial product. And on the left-hand side, that would mean a 25%. The far left-hand side would be a 25% of that application rate. And what you'll see here is that at the higher application rates, there's just greater performance, less variability in performance. Now, on the left-hand side, even at the lowest application rates, in this case, probably levels that are below the label recommendation, you may still see good efficacy. In some cases, if the timing is right, if the population is of a certain level, even low application rates can yield very good results. However, you are opening yourself up to a greater variability. And that's really why it's important to follow the label recommendations to ensure that you're going to get what you pay for, especially if you're timing the applications right to ensure that you're meeting that economic threshold. Then you know that you're going to get the most value out of that application. Now, BT work through ingestion, so application volume actually also matters quite a bit. Larvae can survive a sublethal dose of those BT insecticidal proteins, so over diluting can also impede activity. Here we have an image on the right-hand side where just to show the concentration effect, because here we have this physical material that we're spraying. So if spray volume increases either under heavy pressure or with larger plants, it may be necessary to increase the dosage. Of course, always read and follow label instructions and adhere to those recommended rates. But in VBC, for example, we often use a suggested concentration for the dry formulations, the granule formulations, 1 gram per liter is often our recommended rate to get very consistent, very consistent performance in the field. And of course, it'll vary by product, but keeping concentration in mind is also important to ensure that enough material is getting out into the field to get good coverage of the leaf surface. So here's some of that really cool footage that we collected in Thailand. And here's an example of a really efficient application. Now, I'll mention for the 20th time that commercial BTs are insoluble, and therefore there's no systemic activity. So only foliage that's covered with that spray is going to be protected. Now, for that reason, ensuring complete coverage of the leaf surface, but also inside the plant, trying to get that spray into the whorl can be very important. The early larval stages will feed on the outer leaves, but very quickly those insects will move towards the inner portion of the corn plant. So ensuring that you get enough spray that some of it can drip down into the whorl can ensure that that you'll get good coverage of as much as possible the inner surfaces as well, so that when larvae do move into those inner surfaces, they can be effectively controlled. Because unlike systemic insecticides, where that chemical will move into the whorl naturally as it spreads throughout the plant, these BTs really have to be put where they're going to do the work. Now, here's an example of a poor application, a bit cheeky, where you can see that the application is being made very quickly and high above the foliage. So you're not necessarily getting down deep into the foliage, where you can ensure that both that all of the lower leaves are treated as well, because the larvae will move throughout the plant. They'll begin more often towards the top, but eventually move their way down. So ensuring that you're really getting down into the crop is critically important to get the most out of that BT application. And application equipment actually can make a really big impact on that. This study here is an example of a study we had done in South Africa, looking at the penetration of different spraying techniques towards really deep into the inner canopy of, in this case, grapevines. So a very different crop, but the concept applies through all crops. So these used three different application techniques. On the left-hand side, these are yellow reactive cards. So when exposed to water, that yellow will turn blue. So you can see, using a handheld mist blower, which does have a very powerful spray, but was relatively inefficient at treating the inner canopy. In the middle is an air blast sprayer, which was far more effective at getting good coverage, as that technology can really power through the foliage and ensure that it's getting deep within the canopy. And really, the best coverage that we saw in this particular study was using fogging. Fogging can be one of the best application techniques, especially if the timing is just right, to ensure that the fog really settles onto the crop. Can give the best coverage of any application type, making sure that it would get well into the crop and into all parts of the plant. So application technique is really important. And so for that reason, ensuring that your equipment is calibrated, changing spray nozzles to get a smaller, changing spray nozzles so that they continue to give the appropriate droplet profiles is important to making sure you get the most out of a commercial BT application, since coverage is so important. I know it's not just for BTs, but for all agrochemicals. Making sure that your equipment is properly calibrated is always a great place to start. Now, BT can be applied using really any common sprayers: backpack sprayers, broadcast sprayers, mist blowers, even ultra low volume sprayers like eco fogging or even thermo fogging can be an effective use for commercial BTs. Some of the Valent commercial labels actually have chemigation and overhead sprinklers included, as well as a real common use for commercial BTs is through aerial application, either by fixed wing or by helicopter. Some of these application techniques, not necessarily backpack sprayers, but can be under immensely high pressure. And it's just interesting to note that high pressures really don't affect the crystals or spores. They're not necessarily, so even the extremely high pressures that are experienced during an aerial application or in those ultra low volume sprayers don't affect the product, don't affect the efficacy of the product at all. And so I'll pause here again for any questions about the actual application of the commercial BTs.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Look, if people got questions, please put them in the Q&A. That would be most helpful. That was actually really interesting. I really enjoy seeing the videos. It really kind of
Yeah.
brings it to life, and I really liked the video of the person spraying as well, because you could really see, yeah, just the height, I guess, of what they were spraying at and how fast they were moving through. So really nicely done, Daniel, showing us those key messages. For, I guess, well, there's a couple of questions here. And maybe I'll just start around the spray nozzles. Calibration of equipment is really important. You've really emphasized that. Is that, does someone have to go out and buy a whole lot of different spray nozzles? Because you said you use different spray nozzles, or is that information readily available as well? Where do people find that type of information around calibration of their equipment?
So for the, at least I can speak for Valent Biosciences, that we don't necessarily give specific recommendations on nozzle types that should be used when applying commercial BTs. Maybe Chris might have more specific recommendations. There may be local recommendations, but maybe asking your local retailer or whoever you buy the products from is probably a good place to start. When it comes to BTs, our objective is good coverage, which means that we want a relatively small droplet pattern. So with that being the case, then using nozzles that can give you that kind of efficient coverage would be important. But to my knowledge, we don't have information on the specific differences between nozzle types in an agrochemical setting.
Yeah. Okay. No, it's just a sort of practical question. It's something that maybe could be useful. A question here from Pierre around what about the costs and the availability in retailer shops of BT biopesticides? So it's getting back to kind of a common question that we have that pops up a lot around, is it affordable? So I'm sort of going back a little bit. It sort of relates to application, because you have to be able to afford it and purchase it first.
That's right.
Before you apply it.
No,
So tell us, Daniel, I mean, what and who is that's an interesting question as well. I mean, because there's different sellers in the marketplace. There's the local sort of shop just down the road that will sell all sorts of things sometimes. Is that where you're going to find a BT biopesticide? Or are you going to find it in a particular distributor that specializes in BT biopesticides? Where do people find it, and is it an affordable option?
So I can't speak specifically to what's going to be available where, but nowadays especially we see a really a dramatic increase in the availability of different types of commercial BTs, really covering a number of different price points. Yeah. The BT is manufactured by Valent Biosciences and sold through Sumitomo Chemical. We've developed these products over, I mean, we're coming up on 5 decades being in the marketplace. We put a certain level of emphasis on concentration and on the quality of the formulations. So those products may be a higher cost and might not necessarily be accessible to every grower. That being said, there is a great deal of local production nowadays, and some imported from other areas within Asia that are more cost effective, and that might be more accessible to say a farmer who's growing a smaller, who's growing corn on a smaller farm.
Yeah.
It's always important to keep in mind though that you should really rely on the experiences of those around you. Growing BTs is it's microbiology more than it is chemistry. So you can't so easily measure how much of the active ingredient is in the final product. It's not as easy as maybe synthesizing a chemical, where you have a very specific way of measuring what's in it. So knowing the quality of the product is going to be pretty tough. And so relying on the expertise and the experiences of local researchers that can test those different products and give you some advice on which ones are working best. And of course, talking to your neighbors about what they're using and what's working for them can sort of help you identify those commercial BTs that are going to give you the best result for your money.
Yep, excellent. No, that makes sense. Thanks for that. It was just this pops up a lot. This sort of question, of course, and it's a really important one. Okay, so what we might do is we might move on to the next. I've actually got a couple of questions, people that I'm sort of holding to the end as well, because there's some sort of future sort of focus questions there that I want to ask you at the end, Daniel. So I'm saving a few. But listen, also if you do have questions, people on the application, don't forget to ask it, because here's your expert. There's one question here though that's just popped in. Is there an influence of temperature or direct sunlight? Does that make an impact on how you apply?
Actually, so that's a perfect transition into the next slide that I have, and that was this is actually a very common question and a common misnomer about commercial BTs is whether they need to be applied at night. I've spoken to farmers who have sort of put together, rigs with floodlights and things like that, so they can make applications specifically at night. And it's important to note that commercial BTs don't necessarily need to be applied at a specific time of day. However, applying in the morning or the evening is best, because making that application when the pest is active ensures that they'll eat the product right away. As I mentioned before, commercial BTs have they'll survive on the leaf, or they'll remain active on the leaf for 3 to 5 days. So making an application at a particular time of day really isn't so consequential, because we get a longer duration of activity than, say, with some other biopesticides. Now, that being said, the relative daytime temperatures, things like that, or even nighttime temperatures, don't affect the product themselves, but they do affect the insect's habit. Since BTs work through ingestion, temperatures that exceed what's comfortable for the insect will cause them to stop feeding and make them maybe cause them to become lethargic, in which cases they're not going to become intoxicated by the commercial BTs. There's no contact activity, so simply being in the presence of commercial BTs isn't enough. They really have to eat it. So there's no direct impact of temperature on the product itself, but there is an impact of temperature on the insect itself. And so that's where we see the effects of temperature in the field. Now, this is a video I'd shown previously. So this is a lettuce feeding assay, in this case with second instar diamondback moth. So on the left-hand side, we have a control. This is a leaf dip assay, where the leaves are dipped into either, in the middle there is a BTA formulation of BT, and on the right-hand side is chlorantraniliprole, or the also called Rynaxypyr, or you might find Coragen or Altacor in the field. Now you can see this is a time lapse over in the upper right-hand corner. You can see the number of days that are passing. And if I just start this over again, you'll notice that after about 24 hours, the larvae, both in the BT and the diamide treatments, are actually still relatively active. In the BT treatment, even though those larvae aren't feeding, you can see this one running around like crazy, even up until the second day after application. And this is important to note, because when assessing the effectiveness of a commercial BT application, looking the next day, looking for efficacy later that day, won't necessarily show you what you're going to expect. Commercial BTs have no knockdown activity, and so for that reason, to assess the efficacy of a standalone BT application, it's best to wait a day or two to allow the product to kill the insect through the longer process of sepsis or blood poisoning. Because we're not having an acute effect on the insect, we're causing them to stop feeding and then eventually die through other processes. So for that reason, giving some time before going back out into the field can ensure that you're going to get a really good idea about what actually happened. In this example here, we have what is a much later instar. And you can see that that insect, while we wouldn't expect to effectively kill this insect with a BT, you could see that following a BT application, it's become lethargic, It's not running away. It's definitely acting in a certain way that suggests that it's become intoxicated. This larvae at this stage may not necessarily be killed by the BT, but it's definitely going to slow it down. This is where it also becomes more susceptible to other insecticides, and using that combination for these later instars can be really valuable. Now, commercial BTs are known also to have a broad tank mix compatibility. So tank mixing may be necessary to enhance control or to optimize the number of trips through the field. Now, the only thing that we really need to be, there are two things to keep an eye out for. The first is strong oxidizers, or other compounds that can damage the proteins before application. So for example, oftentimes commercial BTs are used for organic pest control, in which case they can be applied with copper. Long exposure, so over a number of hours to copper, will eventually degrade those cry proteins. So products like that, even some water treatments, can cause protein degradation. Now, products that cause tank pH to exceed around pH 8 to 8.5 can cause the crystals to dissolve prematurely and impact efficacy. Now, the reason why we get 3 to 5 days of activity on the leaf is because crystals are, they're the strongest, some of the strongest forms in nature. And so having those proteins, which are normally very labile and susceptible to damage, having them compacted into those crystals allows them to live a whole lot longer in the environment. So if we dissolve those crystals prematurely in an alkaline solution, then we then expose them to the environment, where we would expect them to lose their efficacy much quicker. So before tank mixing, testing the mixture with a jar test, not only for physical compatibility, but also to see the final pH, can be a good practice. Of course, always adhere to label restrictions against mixing if products do restrict the use of mixing, and always follow the strictest label limitations of the of any product in the tank mix. So just because you include a BT in the mix doesn't necessarily mean you've made that mixture any lower risk than the most toxic component in that mixture. Now, another thing to keep in mind is around fungicides. So fungicides or bactericides. You might automatically assume that anything that kills a bacteria would probably be detrimental to a commercial BT. But keep it in mind that the cry proteins, that those crystals are really the primary mode of action. Then the loss of some spores is not always going to be consequential. The relative impact of spores varies between species. However, the spores themselves are not toxic. It's a contributor to the toxicity, not the toxic component alone. So even if you have something that may impact those spores specifically, it may not affect the overall efficacy of the product. Now, I don't want to give specific recommendations. However, for Valent Biosciences products, for example, the Dipel and Zentari labels, we have a field trial database going back to the early 80s. And I pulled out every product that we had tested, at least in a combination, and those are listed here. You can see it covers a broad spectrum of insecticides, fungicides, and then other tank mix partners, including things like oils, or even UV protectants like this carnauba wax or sulfurs. And in all these cases, we haven't necessarily seen any specific combinations that are incompatible, except, of course, those that will dramatically increase the tank pH and maintain it very high. Now, commercial BTs are also compatible with adjuvants. So spreaders that support coverage, or especially stickers that prevent wash-off, can be beneficial, but they're not always necessary for application. For the sake of time, I'll skim over this one, but we did recently do a study on the impact of water quality. So the starting pH used in a tank mix. So in this case, we mixed the Dipel DF formulation in water that was either pH 4, 7, or 10. to determine if the starting pH of the water made a significant difference on efficacy. What you see here is the mortality of diamondback moth, second instar diamondback moth. And you can see that the starting pH of the water actually wasn't so consequential with this particular formulation. And that was because commercial BTs tend to be very acidic. And so for that reason, it actually efficiently neutralized the high pH of that water source. So this is why doing a jar test can be really important, especially if your local water source is very alkaline, to ensure that the products that you're using will neutralize the pH. If they don't, it may be necessary to use some kind of buffering agent. And finally, when it comes to storing commercial BT products, formulation makes a really big difference. On the left-hand side here, we have the potency of this material in international units, and along the bottom, the months in storage. So the two examples here are a dry granule formulation, which maintained potency at 25 degrees Celsius through 36 months. So this is 3 years in storage at 25 degrees Celsius. Now, even at these relatively normal temperatures of 25C, we see about a more than 60% potency loss in the water-based formulation. And this potency loss is exacerbated by high storage temperatures. So it's always important to follow label recommendations for storage temperature and duration. However, especially in the case of water-based formulations, prolonged exposure to high temperature, for example, non-ventilated storages, can dramatically impact the efficacy of those products, especially the liquid formulations. The worst case I've seen for a dry formulation was it was about 3 to 4 years of storage in a non-ventilated environment where we started to see dramatic efficacy loss. But the liquid formulations are far more acutely susceptible. They don't need to be refrigerated necessarily, but it's an important consideration to keep in mind. And so with that, I'll end with the top 10 considerations for using a BT, really a summary of everything that we've talked about today, beginning with applying as early as is possible, making follow-up applications as necessary, or using a tank mix partner. Coverage is key. So for best results, of course, ensuring full coverage and the lowest volume of water can ensure the best efficacy. Since BT work through ingestion, they're not systemic, coverage is really important. We had just talked about watching the tank pH and being able to use all of the equipment that you have. Now, of course, mixing is okay as BT are compatible with other insecticides, fungicides, and additives, but doing a jar test can ensure that you'll get the most out of your application. We didn't talk about rain fastness, but BT does have some level of rain fastness. Those crystals and spores can kind of wedge themselves within the leaf architecture, but avoiding applications in rainy weather can be valuable, and reapplying if rain occurs before the product dries will be absolutely necessary. So you should expect some wash off from a rain event. Now, applying, they can be applied at day or night, and of course, agitation is required. So these are just really the top 10 considerations, the easy take home that summarizes everything that we've talked about today. And so with that, I'll close with a reminder that when you want to get the most out of a commercial BT, to be successful, you want to focus on timing and coverage and all things that contribute to that.
Daniel, that was fantastic. Wow, I'm actually going to watch that again because I really like how you've used that. Yeah, no, but also you've just really visually reinforced those top 10 tips, which I think is really important in a really nice way that's quite simple to understand, which is great. So thank you so much for that. Got some questions here that I've been saving up. If anyone else has got questions, here's your chance to get them answered. You've got a reaction there already, but really fantastic. So I can't say too much. I mean, I would like to say more, but it's really fantastic today to see those examples. So getting into some questions, we're going to start with this one, and there was a couple of questions earlier on as well around farmers and farmer using BT. So I guess this question was more around, well, how do you best work with farmers to socialize or introduce BT to their practices? Is there any examples where you've sort of worked with smallholder farmers? I mean, maybe you may not need to tell us all the results now, but are there any tips that sort of get farmers sort of trusting this sort of type of new biopesticide for them, or even just a new solution for them? Is there things that work better than others, or that you've seen that's worked well in the field?
Yeah, so I'd appreciate if Chris could give his comments here, but I've mostly worked with distributors and other folks that work with farmers, and in those cases, seeing is believing. That seems to always be the case.
Yeah,
seeing is believing.
Yeah.
But maybe Chris, do you have some comments on that?
Yeah, yes, Daniel. Thanks. Of course, in several countries in Southeast Asia, the BT is a very, very well accepted product. And number one, I would say, is the oil palm segment. Oil palm, it is used for different kind of lepidopteran pests. For the foliar caterpillars we are using, and for the bunch caterpillars it's using. And of course, it is being used for different vegetables, of course, and cabbages, cauliflower, and solanaceous crops, and all those things. As Daniel explained, to see the results, it may not be as attractive as you see in the chemical pesticides. You cannot see the insects dying in front of you on the day one. You have to have some kind of a patience. But again, if the timing is proper, you can see the larvae totally inactive within few hours. Within few hours, you don't have to wait for even longer time. Those who have little bit of the acceptance problem, they would take maybe 1 or 2 times or 3 times. But then once they are convinced with the product, and they will definitely go for the BT product. That is what is my experience with the planters and the vegetable growers in Southeast Asia. Yes, there will be some people have some resistance initially, because the mindset is like the chemical mindset. They would expect the larvae to die instantly. But when we try to explain scientifically and try to understand how the product works, probably they will accept it. They'll understand the product very well. That's what is my experience in the region.
That's great feedback, Chris. I mean, I like what you said, Daniel. Both of you said seeing is believing, but it's also explaining that it's seeing and believing is it's not just about an instant kill, or I think you hit it, the knockdown effect. They're not going to be completely just killed right in front of you, and you'll see all these dead insects. But it's about looking over a couple of days and actually seeing what actually happens. So I think that's a really important lesson. It's a really important part of integrated pest management and education around that. So good point. And Chris, you mentioned a few things there too, and Daniel, you might have an answer here, but Pierre's asking, do you know if your BT formulations are more used in the organic production, and on which crops are they more applied?
Daniel, okay, Daniel, you can continue. Yeah.
No, go ahead. Because you can speak more to the Southeast Asia.
Yeah, we have BT products, both organic certified and non-organic also. And most of our dry formulations are organic certified, and some of our liquid formulations are not organic. It is not certified. But of course, if you look at the use pattern, it is used both for non-organic as well as organic as well. So it is very much accepted in organic segment. And non-organic, as I said, oil palm. Oil palm, they want the oils free of residues of any chemicals. So when they are looking for any chemical which can be used on the bunches, on the oil palm bunches, and this is the only way to control or to reduce or eliminate the residues. So that is very well accepted. But of course, in this segment, both certified and non-certified products are also used here.
And from a global perspective, in some markets like the United States, organic is a dominant use. But outside the U.S., it's actually not. Probably the dominant use is in conventional crops, not necessarily organic.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Here's a question here. I'm just looking at it. Oh, now here we go. Sorry. I've got questions written down everywhere on my piece of paper from before and also here. But in case of 2 applications of BT, how many days between the 2 applications? That was the question from somebody in the room.
So depending on the level of infestation, and maybe Chris can confirm this, but 5 to 7 days between application is as far as you'd want to go if you're using a commercial BT as a standalone treatment.
Chris, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I agree with Daniel. Yes, it is generally 5 to 7 days is good enough. But then in some cases where the infestation level is very high, and people are even going for a little closer rounds, like 2 applications in a week, 3 to 4 days applications. That again, if the infestation is too high, it happens.
Okay.
Otherwise, 5 days is good enough. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Now another question here is, now when farmers, when you buy this product, and I know you can only speak for your own product, but how much does and this is a very practical question, how much does a farmer normally have to buy? I mean, can they buy small amounts, or is it, I mean, because sometimes you may only have 2 hectares, for example. So are you forced into buying quite a lot at once, or are there sort of different solutions and amounts that you can buy for different farmers' needs?
I think products available in small package also, 500 ml package and half kilo packages are all available. So you did not have to buy a huge quantity, but most of the BT products are recommended to be used at a low rate only, something around say half kilo to 1 kilo per hectare, depends on the label rate. So no need to buy a large quantity. I think small packs are available in the market. Yep.
Excellent. Thanks. Now I have a question here, and it's quite a lengthy question, and you've sort of answered this in the session, but I'm just going to put it out there. You showed the test of BT on the second instar diamondback moth in day 1, 2, and 3. Which day is the BT effective, and the effective percentage on the second instar?
So the day that's effective is within hours of application.
Okay.
So Chris was mentioning just a minute ago about how you don't necessarily see the larvae falling off the leaf, but you can notice that they'll become lethargic and they'll stop feeding. And that's what's really important about those pictures, is that even though those larvae may still be moving around, once you start perforating their stomach, they can no longer digest food. And they'll stop eating. I mean, that's just as plain and simple as that. So it will effectively stop feeding as early as within hours of application. And across I don't quite understand the rest of the question, but by 3 days, everything should be dead. That's sort of our, whenever we do assays like that, looking out in the field, by 3 days after application, if a larvae is going to be killed by a commercial BT, it will be dead by 3 days.
Yep. Okay. No, that's excellent. No, that's good response there. And I think that sort of answers most of the question. I've got one last question here before we end, and it's somebody asked, how do you see the future of BT technology? What kind of advances might be coming in the future? Thanks for that question. Somebody, we're really going to put Daniel on the spot here from what's commercialization, what's on the horizon, what are the new advances?
So what I've seen on the horizon for commercial BTs is really is, not to say strain engineering, but the types of strains that we find in the marketplace. There's some really interesting new strains coming out in Brazil that are introducing new cry proteins that haven't been seen in the market yet. There's been a great deal of innovation in the types of insecticidal proteins that are introduced into genetically modified crops. But that same level of innovation hasn't been put into the sprayable form quite yet. But now with the incredible myriad of tools that are available to researchers for selecting something new and for using genetics and those kind of tools to identify something that's really unique. I think that's the first thing you'll see coming to the market. Aside from small changes in formulations or concentrations, the biggest changes are going to be in the types of strains that we see coming to the market, or combinations therein. Those are going to be the big moves for the future.
Excellent. That's a great place to leave it, I
Interesting
think,
question.
too. Yeah, it was a great
Yeah.
question, I thought. But it's a great place to leave it as well. It's always nice to think about the future and also what's happening. So, Daniel, I don't know if you can share the slides just again at the end, because I was just going to put up a couple, a reminder to everyone about what's coming up. But while you're doing that, I'm going to just take the opportunity to really thank you and Chris and Katie and the team, and also bringing us that footage from Thailand. And it's really nice to see it visually and have a reminder of what you're talking about, sort of at the same time of what happens in the field. And you've got lots of reactions, by the way. You've got lots of hearts there and lots of thumbs up were coming through. So I think it was absolutely super. So we're really pleased and thank you so much. So we're looking forward to continuing the relationship as well and working together in the future. So
Likewise.
So thank you from me. I'd also like to just thank everyone for joining us today. I'd like to invite you to our next session, which will be on the 11th of August. We'll be looking at that new frontiers sort of space and maybe sort of pushing the boundaries a little bit and looking even maybe a bit longer term than just in the next sort of 5 years, but even beyond. So it could be a really interesting session, I think. It will be. And then we're following it up with quite a few other sessions through the year. So please join us for those sessions. Just moving forward, and just a reminder, you can register for all those sessions on the ASEAN Fall Armyworm Action page. You can also watch all these sessions as well, which will be posted there, and I'll send an email out per usual. Just on the last slide, Daniel, I'm just going to remind everyone that this is the ASEAN Action Plan and Fall Armyworm. We're really excited to have everyone join this action plan, and we're really grateful to the overall donor and sponsors, in particular the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia, but also the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development in Vietnam, and ASEAN Secretariat in Grow Asia, and soon to be CSIRO as well, who will be helping out with the Secretariat services. So thank you to everyone. I'd wish you a very happy July, which is going to be starting very soon, and we'll see you back in August. So take care. And to you, special mention to Daniel and Chris. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.